I'm a man of 70 years. You might think I've seen it all by now, watched the world change, lost a few friends along the way, dealt with the heartbreak of watching my children grow up, leave home, and build their own lives. My name's Walter Thompson, and I've spent my life working as a mechanic, fixing cars and engines, the kind of work that gets your hands dirty but leaves you with a sense of pride. You can't be too squeamish when you spend decades in the trenches of grease and steel. But there was one thing I never expected to get dirty: family. It all started at a simple dinner gathering at my daughter Hannah's house. Hannah had married Greg about 5 years ago, a man I couldn't have been happier to welcome into the family. He was smart, charming, and seemed to respect the values I held dear: family, hard work, and respect. But as the years went by, I started noticing cracks in the surface. He became more distant, a little too focused on his career, and his attitude began to shift. I thought maybe it was just the stress of life catching up with him, but it wasn't until that dinner that I realized how wrong I'd been. Hannah had invited me over for a family gathering, just the usual Sunday roast, a few laughs, and the kind of conversation that often veers into politics or local gossip. It was nothing special, but I always enjoyed spending time with my daughter. She's the light of my life, and seeing her happy meant everything to me. Greg had never been the most talkative guy at family dinners, always content to sit back with a beer in his hand and let the rest of us chatter away, but I thought nothing of it. People have their ways. That night, however, something felt off. It was in the air, this subtle tension that you couldn't quite put your finger on. It didn't help that the dinner table was a little more crowded than usual. A couple of Hannah's friends had come over, and of course, Greg's brother, Brad, was there too. Brad was a fine guy, never had a problem with him. But Greg? Greg was quiet, like he was somewhere else, and that's when it started. Hannah had just finished serving the roast and was making her way around the table, topping up everyone's wine glasses. That's when it happened: Greg suddenly snapped. It was like a switch had been flipped, and all the charm he'd once had came crashing down. "Dad," he said, looking at me with a sharp edge in his voice. "You gonna eat that? Or just sit there looking grumpy like you always do?" I blinked, not sure I'd heard him right. A few people at the table laughed nervously, but I wasn't amused. I didn't have time for this kind of disrespect. "Greg," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice calm, "I've spent my whole life working hard to put food on the table for my family. I've earned the right to sit and enjoy a meal without being ridiculed." I didn't expect what happened next. He sneered, leaning back in his chair, his arms slung across the backrest like he owned the whole damn place. "Yeah, well, it's hard to enjoy a meal when you've never done anything else with your life but get your hands dirty. You always act like you're some kind of hero, but what's the point of all that hard work if you've got nothing to show for it?" The room fell silent. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I couldn't believe Greg had the nerve to speak to me like that, let alone in front of my own daughter and her friends. Hannah, sitting across from me, looked shocked but didn't say anything. It was like she didn't even know what to do. She just shifted uncomfortably in her chair, glancing between me and Greg. Her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and confusion, but she didn't intervene. "Greg, that's enough," I said, trying to hold back the anger boiling inside of me. I wasn't going to let him do this, not to me, not in front of my family. But he wasn't done. "You know, Walter," he continued, his voice growing louder, "you act like you're some kind of example, but you've got nothing. You never went to college, you never made anything of yourself. You think you're some kind of role model, but you're just a fossil, stuck in the past." I felt the sting of his words cut through me like a blade. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the heat rising to my face. Every single person at that table was watching me, waiting for me to respond. It was like a public execution, only the executioner was my son-in-law. I don't know where it came from, but something inside me snapped. It wasn't anger, it was clarity. I stood up, slowly, and placed my hands on the edge of the table. I looked Greg in the eyes, and I spoke, my voice steady but sharp. "You're right about one thing, Greg," I said. "I didn't go to college. I didn't get a fancy degree. But I've built a life with my own two hands, something you wouldn't understand. I've worked hard, and I've earned every penny I've got. So don't you dare stand there and try to tear me down in front of my family." Greg looked taken aback for a moment, like he hadn't expected me to stand up to him. But instead of backing down, he just laughed. "You're pathetic," he said. "You're an old man clinging to the past. Let's face it, you're irrelevant." That's when Hannah finally spoke up. "Greg, stop," she said, her voice trembling. "This is not the time or the place for this." But Greg wasn't listening. He looked at me one last time, his eyes cold and unfeeling, and muttered, "Whatever. Let's just finish dinner." I sat back down, the weight of his words lingering in the air like a cloud. My heart was racing, but I didn't know what to do. I felt humiliated, betrayed. But I wasn't going to let him have the last word. I would find a way to make him pay for this. The days after the dinner passed in a haze. I didn't see Greg much, he and Hannah were busy with work, and I didn't want to bring the subject up, not yet. But every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear his words echoing in my mind, "You're irrelevant." The anger, the humiliation, it burned inside me, and I knew I couldn't let it slide. This wasn't just a little misunderstanding or a harsh word, it was a direct assault on my pride, my years of hard work, my entire life. I tried to keep my distance, keeping busy with the things I always had, working in my garage, fixing old cars, making small talk with the neighbors. But it wasn't enough. I needed something more. I needed to make him see what he had done and show him that his little slap in the face wouldn't go unanswered. He had a lot of nerve, but I had something he didn't: experience. I started paying attention to details I'd ignored before. Greg's financial situation had always seemed solid. He worked in real estate, had a decent job, but there was something about his life that didn't quite add up. I didn't know exactly what it was yet, but I was going to find out. It wasn't just the insult at the dinner table, it was everything that had been building up over the past few years. I had heard whispers in the family, casual mentions from Hannah's friends about how Greg had been cutting corners with his business deals. He was too ambitious, too eager to impress, and I could see that he was desperate to climb higher, no matter who he had to step on to get there. But that didn't interest me as much as the way he had dismissed me. The way he'd belittled everything I had worked for, as if I were nothing more than a relic from a time that no longer mattered. I wasn't going to let it go. Not just for me, but for my daughter too. If Greg could do this to me, what would he do to her? It was time to put my mind to work. I wasn't going to retaliate with anger, no, I would use my head. And as I thought about it, an idea began to take shape. I called Hannah the next day, trying to sound casual. "Hey, sweetheart. How've you been?" She was always so busy with work, but I could tell she was stressed. "Oh, you know, just the usual. Greg's been working non-stop, and I've got a million things to juggle. But you're all right, Dad? After what happened last night?" I smiled to myself. She knew something was off, but not enough to dig deeper. She always wanted to believe the best in Greg, even though I could see how he'd been pulling away from her. I wasn't going to push her into a confrontation, not yet. "I'm fine, kiddo. Just been keeping busy," I replied. "Actually, I was wondering. You and Greg have been talking about moving into that new house of his. How's that going? Any issues with the bank?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Why do you ask?" "Oh, just curious," I said casually. "You know how it is. Things don't always line up as smoothly as they look." "Well, I don't know," he said. "Everything's fine. But I know he's been meeting with that financial advisor. I think they're trying to find ways to invest more or whatever." My ears perked up. Financial advisor. That was a name I'd have to remember. There it was, something I could work with. I needed more. Greg's finances were the key to his downfall. If I could get close enough, maybe I could uncover something, anything, that would put him in a position where he'd have to pay for his arrogance. I hung up the phone and thought about it for a while. I knew the best way to deal with someone like Greg was through subtlety. I wasn't going to rush this. I'd bide my time, just like I had in my work, fixing old cars, always patient, always precise. If I could find a way into Greg's financials, if I could uncover a secret deal or a hidden debt, then maybe, just maybe, I'd have the leverage I needed. I decided to start with something simple, one of Greg's business associates. A guy named Rick Waters, someone I'd met a few times at family gatherings. Rick had always struck me as a bit shady, the kind of guy who dressed in too much cologne and had an answer for everything. He was the kind of person who made you wonder how he got his wealth. There were whispers about him around town, but nothing concrete. He wasn't the kind of guy you'd want your daughter to associate with, but Greg seemed to trust him. I made a mental note to pay him a visit. The next day, I went to a local cafe where I knew Rick liked to hang out. I had no intention of starting a confrontation, I just wanted information. I walked in and spotted him at the corner table, sipping a coffee and reading the newspaper. He looked up as I approached, and his face froze for a moment, as if he wasn't expecting to see me. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his tone polite but stiff. "How are you?" I smiled and took a seat across from him. "I'm good, Rick. Been keeping busy. How about you? Heard you've been helping Greg with some investments lately." Rick stiffened slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Oh, just the usual. Helping out where I can. Greg's got a lot on his plate, but he's doing well. Things are moving forward." I nodded slowly, watching him. "I bet. It's always good to have someone who knows their way around money, isn't it?" Rick's eyes darted for a moment, a flash of discomfort. "Well, that's the goal, right? To make smart decisions." "Of course," I said, leaning in slightly. "Smart decisions. It's funny, though. I've been thinking a lot lately about all the talk around town. People mention that Greg's been doing some things behind the scenes. Private deals, investments that seem a little, well, off the books. Any truth to that?" Rick's smile faltered. For a moment, I thought he might spill something, but then he caught himself and straightened up. "I wouldn't know anything about that, Mr. Thompson. You should ask Greg if you're curious." I could tell he was lying, but I didn't press it further. "Fair enough," I said, standing up to leave. "Just thought I'd check in. You have a good day, Rick." As I walked out of the cafe, I felt a spark of triumph. I didn't get what I wanted today, but I was closer. I could see the cracks in Greg's world, and I was going to exploit them. It was a few days after my meeting with Rick, and I was starting to feel the weight of the pieces beginning to fall into place. It wasn't just one little secret. No, this was bigger than I had expected. I had a hunch about Greg's shady business dealings, but it wasn't until I did some digging that I realized just how tangled his web had become. The more I found, the more I knew this wasn't just about a humiliating dinner, it was about justice. Greg had made himself my enemy, and I wasn't about to let him off easy. I started by reaching out to a few old contacts, friends I had from my younger days, people who might know something about the kinds of shady deals that Greg and his business associate Rick were involved in. One of those friends was an old lawyer named Frank. Frank and I hadn't spoken in years, but I knew he still kept his ear to the ground when it came to matters of finance and business. It didn't take long to convince him to meet up for a coffee, and when I arrived at the small cafe he'd suggested, he was already waiting. Frank was in his late 60s, his hair a bit grayer than I remembered, but his eyes were sharp as ever. I sat down, and after a few moments of small talk, I got to the point. "Frank, I need your help," I said, keeping my voice steady. You remember Greg, right? My son-in-law. He's been getting into some things lately, some business dealings that don't seem quite right. I need to know if there's anything off the books I should be worried about. Frank raised an eyebrow. Greg's been up to something, you say? Yeah, he's been working with Rick Waters. A guy who's got a reputation for cutting corners. I need to know if there's anything I can do to get my hands on the truth. Frank leaned back in his chair, looking at me thoughtfully. He didn't respond immediately, as if weighing his words carefully. You know, Walter, he said, Greg's not the kind of guy who just falls into trouble on his own. I'm sure he's got a few things going that he'd rather keep under wraps. I nodded. I'm sure of that too. But I need to know what kind of things. Can you help me get a peek into his financials? I don't need anything too complicated, just enough to know what he's hiding. Frank hesitated. It's not that simple. You can't just go digging around in someone's finances without a good reason. And Greg's a smart guy. He'd cover his tracks. But, he said, his tone changing slightly, if you're serious, there are ways. But they won't be pretty. You'll have to be prepared for what you find. I leaned forward, my voice firm. I'm ready. After a moment, Frank nodded. All right, I can help. There's a way to find out what you're looking for, public records, some of Greg's old transactions that haven't been fully sealed yet. It won't be easy, but I can make a few calls. I'll take anything I can get, I said. Over the next few days, Frank worked his magic. He dug through a few public financial records, connected with some old colleagues, and started pulling up bits of information that Greg and Rick had probably hoped would stay buried. The first bit of information that came through was an old transaction, a property deal that Greg had been involved in a year ago. It wasn't public knowledge, but it was there, buried deep in the local records. The property had been sold for much less than it's worth, far less than it should have gone for. I knew something wasn't right. Greg had a history of flipping houses and making money, but this wasn't just a bad deal, it was a giveaway. But why? What was he hiding? Frank called me the next day. Walter, he said, his voice low, I've got something. There's more to this than just bad deals. Greg's been using that property as collateral for a loan from some private lender. The terms are, let's just say they're not standard. I felt a chill run through me. How bad is it? Frank paused for a moment, then spoke with careful precision. If the loan defaults, and with the way Greg's been handling things, it looks like it will, the lender gets to take control of not only that property but a few others tied to Greg's name. And that's not all. The lender's been slipping some money under the table in ways that could get both of them into real trouble. It's bad, Walter. Real bad. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Greg had gotten himself into a financial mess, and now I had the proof. If he couldn't pay back this loan, and there was a good chance he wouldn't, he'd lose everything. The whole family would be dragged into his scandal, and I wasn't about to let that happen. But I couldn't just go to Hannah with this, not yet. She wouldn't believe me, not without proof, and Greg would just spin the story in his favor, making me out to be the villain. No, I had to be smarter. I had to use the information I had to my advantage, and only then would I reveal the truth. The next step was finding out exactly what Greg was planning. If I could get close enough, I could gather enough evidence to confront him with everything, and if things went the way I planned, he wouldn't see it coming. That night, I sat in my garage, the flickering light overhead casting long shadows across the walls. My mind was buzzing, the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together. I'd made a plan, but I had to be careful. Greg thought he was in control, but what he didn't know was that I had the one thing he didn't, patience. The following week, I received a call from Frank. His voice was sharp, urgent. Walter, you're not going to believe this. I found the meeting details. Greg's going to meet with the lender in 2 days. He doesn't know I've got the details yet, but it's all there. I've got the location, the time, and the names of the people involved. I felt a rush of adrenaline. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. I had to act fast. I'd spent days digging into Greg's finances, watching his every move, and now, finally, the chance to confront him was within my grasp. But I knew I couldn't just show up and throw everything in his face. No, I had to be strategic. I needed leverage, and I needed it now. I thanked Frank, and with a deep breath, I began making my preparations. The meeting was set for a small conference room in a hotel downtown, a place I knew Greg would feel comfortable in, a place where he could control the narrative. He'd think it was just another routine business meeting. But it wouldn't be. The night before the meeting, I reviewed everything I had, copies of the financial records, the transaction details, even some photos I'd managed to snap when Greg had been out of the house. I'd followed him once to the office of the private lender, just to confirm the name of the company involved. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I had Greg backed into a corner, and I wasn't going to let him slip out of it. The next morning, I dressed in a simple suit, nothing too flashy, just something that would help me blend in. I didn't want Greg to know I was there. I wanted him to believe that everything was business as usual. As I pulled into the parking lot of the hotel, I saw Greg's car already parked by the entrance. He was early, probably trying to make an impression. The man had a need for control like I'd never seen. I parked a few spaces away from his car and waited. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I didn't let it show. I was ready. I made my way into the hotel's lobby, my steps deliberate. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I had to be invisible. I found the conference room with no trouble. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear voices from inside. Greg's voice, unmistakable, and the deeper tones of the lender. I paused for a moment outside the door, gathering my thoughts. What if this didn't work? What if Greg figured out what I was doing? It didn't matter. I'd come this far, and I wasn't backing down now. I pushed the door open just a crack, enough to see through the small gap. Greg sat at the head of the table, leaning back in his chair, looking every bit the confident businessman. He was smiling, talking in that way he did when he thought he had the upper hand. Across from him sat the lender, a tall man with a sharp suit and an even sharper gaze. The two of them were deep in conversation, and from what I could hear, it was about the loan and its terms. I couldn't hear all the details, but I didn't need to. What I had was enough. I stepped back and moved around the side of the hotel. There was a fire escape on the side of the building, just behind the conference room. It wasn't the most glamorous way in, but it would work. I climbed the ladder and slipped into a back window on the second floor. The room was quiet as I crept down the hall. I checked the time. Greg was still in the meeting. I'd estimated it would take about an hour for them to wrap things up. I had one shot at this. I needed to get into the conference room and leave a message. I couldn't afford to confront Greg yet. But I could leave something that would rattle him, something that would make him think twice. I waited for the sound of footsteps to fade down the hall. As soon as the coast was clear, I slipped into the conference room, careful not to make a sound. The table was littered with papers, some of them signed, some of them not. I went straight to the corner, where Greg's pile of papers sat. There it was, the key document. I quickly took a photo of the loan agreement with my phone, zooming in on the fine print. The loan terms were more extreme than Frank had let on. If Greg didn't pay back the money, he stood to lose not just his property, but a stake in his business, too. This wasn't just a financial issue. It was his entire future hanging by a thread. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and took one more look around the room. The loan papers were clearly meant to be kept hidden, but now they were in my hands. I was holding Greg's fate. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something else, an email on the open laptop at the far end of the room. It was a chain of messages between Greg and Rick, and the subject line caught my eye: the backup plan. Curious, I walked over and clicked on the thread. It was a series of exchanges about a contingency plan in case the loan defaulted. They'd been preparing for it. Greg had been gambling with more than just his assets, he'd been playing with his entire future, knowing that if the loan failed, he had a backup option. But what was it? I took a screenshot of the entire conversation. This was more than just a financial mess. There was something deeper here, something Greg didn't want anyone to know about. Just as I was about to exit the room, I heard the door open behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. Greg's voice rang out in the hallway, followed by the low hum of the lenders. They were finishing up. I needed to move fast. I backed away from the laptop and slipped out the door, closing it as quietly as I could. I had everything I needed. I hurried back to the fire escape, my mind racing with what I'd just uncovered. I had the loan documents, the backup plan emails, and a full picture of Greg's financial disaster. It was late when I returned home, my head spinning with everything I had discovered. The documents were safely stored, tucked away in an envelope that felt like a ticking time bomb. I knew I had to confront Greg soon. The longer I waited, the more control he'd have over the situation, and the more likely he'd find a way to turn it all around and make me the villain. No, it was time to strike. I sat down in my study, staring at the papers spread out before me. The loan agreement, the backup plan emails, all of it was damning. But there was something else, something I had to remind myself of. Greg was smart, and he would not go down easily. He might try to twist the truth, turn this into some kind of misunderstanding. But I was done letting him get away with it. This time, I was going to make sure he paid. The phone rang, and I glanced at the screen. It was Hannah. I hadn't told her yet about what I'd uncovered. She didn't know the extent of Greg's financial mess, and I wasn't sure how to break it to her. But I had to, she deserved the truth. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Dad?" Hannah's voice came through, tinged with concern. "Is everything okay? You've been acting distant lately." "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said, trying to sound calm. "But I need to talk to you about something. Something important." There was a brief pause on the other end. "What is it?" I took a deep breath. "It's about Greg." Hannah's tone shifted instantly. "Dad, not this again. I know you've never liked him, but—" "Hannah, please," I interrupted, my voice steady but firm. "I'm not trying to cause trouble. I've got information, things I found out about Greg's finances. It's serious. You need to know what's going on." She was quiet for a moment. "What are you talking about?" "I'm going to send you the details. But you need to know, Greg's been hiding things. He's gotten into a financial mess. And if you don't believe me, you can see it for yourself." "Dad, this isn't the time." "It's the perfect time, Hannah," I said, cutting her off. "If you don't believe me, I'll show you everything." I could hear her breathing heavily on the other end of the line. "Fine. Send me the details. But I swear, if this is another one of your gut feelings, I'm going to lose it." "I'm not guessing, Hannah," I said, my voice tinged with urgency. "I'm giving you the truth. Just trust me on this." We hung up, and I sat back in my chair, the weight of everything I had uncovered pressing down on me. The last thing I wanted was to break up my daughter's marriage. But the truth was the truth, and I couldn't live with myself if I let Greg continue to manipulate her. I sent Hannah the email. It had everything: Greg's dealings, the loan, the backup plan. I included a note: "Please read this carefully. You deserve to know what's really going on." I knew she would be angry. Hell, I would be too if I found out the man I married had been hiding things from me. But this wasn't just about their marriage anymore. It was about Greg's lies catching up to him, and he needed to face the consequences. The next morning, I received a call. It was Hannah again, her voice tight, barely able to hide the storm behind it. "Dad, I just got your email," she said, her words clipped. "What is all this? Why didn't you tell me sooner? I didn't want to hurt you, sweetheart. I really didn't. But I can't watch him drag you down like this. I can't believe it. I mean, I knew Greg was, well, I knew he wasn't perfect, but I didn't think he was this bad." There was a pause, and then a frustrated sigh. What am I supposed to do now? I didn't have an answer for her. I wasn't sure what she should do, but I knew one thing: Greg had crossed a line. And he wasn't going to get away with it. You don't have to decide right now. But you need to think about what's best for you. And for your future. I can't even look at him the same way anymore. Not after this, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know what I'm supposed to believe anymore. I'm sorry, I said softly. But this isn't just about you. This is about Greg being held accountable. He's not the man you think he is, and you need to see that for yourself. There was a long pause before she spoke again. I'm going to confront him. I have to. I can't live like this. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. Just be careful, Hannah. Greg won't go down without a fight. I hung up the phone, feeling a mixture of guilt and relief. I had done what I could. Now, it was up to my daughter to face the truth. And when she did, Greg would have no choice but to answer for everything he'd done. The confrontation was inevitable. I didn't have to wait long before Greg came over to the house. He showed up that afternoon, looking as smug and confident as ever. Hannah and I were sitting in the living room when he walked in, his expression immediately hardening when he saw me. He didn't even acknowledge me at first, he just looked at Hannah. "What's this I hear about you snooping through my business?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, but I could hear the anger simmering just beneath the surface. Hannah didn't back down. "You've been hiding things from me, Greg. I know about the loan, the backup plan, everything. How could you lie to me like this?" Greg's jaw clenched. He looked like he was about to say something, but he paused, taking in a deep breath. "Hannah, this isn't what you think. I was trying to protect you." "Protect me?" she snapped, her voice rising. "From the truth? How does lying to me and hiding things protect me, Greg?" I stood up and walked over to them. "You think you can just lie your way through this, Greg? You've been using my daughter as a pawn in your game. Well, your game's over now." Greg turned to me, his face turning red with rage. "You think you can control me, old man? You've got no idea what I'm capable of." "I know exactly what you're capable of," I said, my voice cold. "And you're going to pay for it." Greg's face twisted with fury as he stepped closer, his fists clenching at his sides. "You think I'm some kind of fool?" he spat, his voice rising with every word. "You think you can just walk into my life, drag up all this old crap, and make me pay for it?" I stood my ground, feeling the heat of his anger but refusing to back down. "You've been lying to my daughter, Greg. You've been lying to everyone, and now you're going to face the truth. You don't get to keep hiding behind that pretty smile of yours anymore." Hannah, still sitting across from us, looked torn. Her face was flushed with a mixture of confusion and anger, and I could see the pain in her eyes. She loved Greg, or at least, she thought she did. But she couldn't deny the truth now, not with everything I had uncovered. "Greg," she said, her voice trembling, "why didn't you tell me about any of this? Why did you hide everything? I thought we were building something together, but you've been keeping secrets from me. From all of us." Greg glared at her, his voice dripping with venom. "You don't understand, Hannah. I had to do what I did. You wouldn't have understood if I'd told you the truth. I was trying to protect you from the mess I was in." His eyes shifted to me, and his tone turned even colder. "You think you've got me figured out, old man? You have no idea what I've been through to get here. I could feel the tension tightening in the room like a noose, and I knew that now was the time to reveal the final blow. I don't need to understand your mess, Greg, I said, my voice steady but firm. I know what you've been doing, and I've got the proof. You've been playing with fire, thinking you could get away with everything. But this time, the game's over. I pulled the envelope from my jacket pocket and opened it, taking out the loan documents and the email screenshots. I spread them out in front of Greg, making sure he saw every detail. The terms of the loan, the hidden backup plan, and the private conversations between him and Rick, it was all there. You think you can get away with cheating people, Greg? With using them for your own gain? I asked, watching as his eyes darted to the papers in front of him. His face turned pale, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered, his voice suddenly much quieter. These aren't what they look like. Oh, they're exactly what they look like, I said coldly. You've been hiding money, using properties as collateral, making deals under the table. You've been gambling with everything you've built, and now it's all coming back to bite you. You've been lying to everyone, including your wife. Greg's eyes flicked to Hannah, and I could see the panic in them now. He was unraveling, losing control. But it wasn't enough. I wasn't about to let him weasel his way out of this. Hannah, look at the details, I said, my voice softer now. This is what Greg's been doing behind your back. He's been playing you for a fool. Hannah reached for the papers, her hands shaking as she sifted through them. She stopped when she saw the email thread. Her face fell, and she looked up at Greg, her eyes filled with disbelief. You've been lying to me, she whispered, her voice breaking. This whole time? Greg opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was backed into a corner, and he knew it. For the first time, I saw the mask of control slip off his face. He was no longer the confident, charming man he had once appeared to be. He was a man cornered by his own lies. Hannah, listen to me, Greg finally said, his voice strained. I never wanted you to find out like this. I just wanted to make things right. I was trying to fix it, okay? I was trying to fix everything, and I couldn't. But I didn't want to lose you. I thought if I could just get everything back on track, you wouldn't have to worry. Hannah shook her head slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. Greg, you don't understand. It's not about the money. It's about the lies. It's about how you've been hiding things from me, from everyone. You never trusted me enough to be honest. I could see the pain in her eyes, the hurt from years of believing in someone who had deceived her. The weight of the truth was too much for her to bear in that moment, and I knew there was nothing I could do to fix it. She had to face it on her own. Greg reached out to her, his hand trembling as he tried to touch her arm. Hannah, please, don't leave me. I can fix this. I swear I can fix it. But Hannah pulled away, her face a mix of anger and heartbreak. No, Greg. I can't trust you anymore. I don't know who you are anymore. Her voice cracked as she added, I need time to think. I need space. For a moment, everything was still. The silence hung heavy in the air as Greg stood there, his face twisted in frustration, while Hannah sat with her head in her hands, trying to process the shock of it all. I stepped forward, my voice quiet but resolute. Greg, it's over. You've crossed a line you can't come back from. You've lied to the people who loved you. And now you'll have to face the consequences. Greg's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, he seemed defeated. What do you want from me? I looked him square in the eyes, my voice cold and unforgiving. I want you to face the truth. To take responsibility for what you've done. I want you to stop playing games with people's lives, Greg. This is your reckoning. Greg didn't say anything else. He turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. He didn't look back. As the door closed behind him, I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders. It wasn't over, far from it. But for the first time, I knew I'd done the right thing. Greg had been caught in his own lies, and there was no way out. Hannah sat in silence for a long time, her face pale, her hands still shaking. I didn't know what to say. She had to process this on her own, but I could tell she was torn between love for her husband and the painful realization of what he had done. The days following our confrontation were filled with a strange kind of stillness. The house felt emptier somehow, even though I hadn't left. Greg's absence was like a shadow in every room, and Hannah was nowhere near ready to talk about it. She barely left her room, barely spoke, her mind clearly torn between everything she thought she knew about Greg and the man who had been revealed to her in one agonizing blow. I left her space, as much as I wanted to comfort her. She needed to process the betrayal in her own way, and I couldn't do much but give her time. But I wasn't going to let Greg get away with this. No, I wasn't done yet. It didn't take long before the consequences started catching up to Greg. The first sign came when his business dealings began unraveling. The private lender Greg had been hiding behind, the one he'd been using to cover up his debts, came out of the shadows. He wasn't the kind of man to quietly let an arrangement fail. No, he wanted his money, and he was going to get it. Fast. Greg's debts were bigger than he had ever let on. And now, with the loan defaulting, the lender wasn't about to give him any more time. There was a story in the local news, a small blurb at first, about a high-profile real estate investor facing financial troubles, but that was just the beginning. I started hearing whispers. Greg's name was all over the place. The lender had taken legal action. His properties were going into foreclosure. And that wasn't the worst of it. The backup plan I'd uncovered, well, it wasn't just about losing properties. Greg had been skimming money off the top of nearly every deal he'd been involved in, funneling it into side accounts he thought no one would ever find. I knew Greg wasn't going to take this sitting down, but I didn't expect him to make his next move so soon. I was at home one afternoon when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find a young man standing there, dressed in a suit. He had a briefcase in hand, and a look on his face that said he wasn't here for casual conversation. "Mr. Thompson?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. "That's me. Can I help you?" I replied, eyeing him cautiously. "I'm a representative from Greg Sterling's legal team. I've been asked to deliver this on his behalf," the man said, holding out the briefcase. I took it from him without saying a word, my mind already racing. What was Greg up to now? I didn't open it right away. Instead, I waited for the man to leave, closing the door behind him. The sound of the latch clicking echoed in the quiet house as I set the briefcase on the kitchen counter. It took me a minute to muster the nerve to open it. Inside, I found a stack of legal papers, more than I expected. At the top of the pile was a cease and desist letter from Greg's lawyer, demanding that I stop interfering with his personal and business affairs. The letter was threatening, accusing me of defamation and harassment, claiming that my actions were damaging his reputation and causing him unnecessary stress. It was a thinly veiled attempt to shut me up. But it was the papers underneath that caught my attention. They were documents related to the properties Greg was trying to salvage, properties he'd been using as collateral to cover up his hidden debts. There were also contracts that showed Greg had been engaging in shady dealings with Rick Waters, hiding assets and funneling money into offshore accounts. The legal team was trying to clean up Greg's mess, but it was obvious that the foundation had cracked wide open. I let out a deep breath, feeling a surge of vindication. This was more evidence, more ammunition I could use if it came to a head. Greg wasn't going to win this fight. But Greg's legal team wasn't the only one to make a move. The lender had filed a lawsuit, demanding repayment of the loan and taking action to seize the assets tied to Greg's business. The entire mess was unraveling in public now, with headlines flashing across the local news. Hannah called me later that day, her voice shaky. "Dad, it's all over the news. They're saying Greg's business is in trouble. People are talking about him, saying he's involved in all this shady stuff. What's happening? What did you do? Hannah, I said gently, my voice steady, I didn't do this. Greg did this. He lied, he cheated, and he kept you in the dark about it. I only showed you the truth. I know, she said quietly. But now everyone knows. Everyone's looking at him like he's some kind of criminal. I don't know if I can handle this. I could hear the pain in her voice, and my heart ached for her. She was hurting in a way that I couldn't fix, not immediately. But I knew this was the only way forward. Sweetheart, it's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. Greg's the one who brought all this on himself. You deserve better than the life he tried to build around you. I don't know what to do, she said, her voice breaking. I don't even know who he is anymore. Hannah, I said, my voice firm but kind, you don't need to fix him. You just need to take care of yourself. You deserve peace, not this constant worry and deceit. I paused for a moment, letting the silence settle between us. We'll figure this out. But first, you need to focus on you. She sniffled on the other end. You're right. I don't know how I'm supposed to get through this, but I'll try. Later that week, Greg made his move. He showed up at my house, the last place I expected him to come. He was visibly shaken, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. Walter, he said, his voice rough. I need to talk to you. I crossed my arms and stood at the door, watching him closely. What do you want, Greg? I can't fix this, okay? He stammered. I'm losing everything. My business is falling apart, and my reputation's in ruins. You've done this to me. You've ruined my life. I didn't flinch. No, Greg. You ruined your own life. You made those choices, and now you have to face the consequences. It's not my fault you chose greed over honesty. He looked away for a moment, his face pale. I was just trying to survive. To make something of myself. But now it's all falling apart. You've lied and cheated, Greg. And now you have to pay for it. There's no escaping that. Greg looked at me, his eyes wild with desperation. Is this what you wanted? To destroy me? To make me lose everything? I stood firm, not backing down. You did this to yourself. And now you're going to face it. He stared at me for a moment longer, and then, as if realizing there was no point in fighting anymore, he turned and walked away. The next few days were a blur. Greg's business quickly folded under the pressure. The lender took control of the properties, and his assets were seized. His reputation, what was left of it, crashed in a public spectacle. The legal fallout was immense. People who had once trusted Greg now saw him for who he truly was, a man who had built his empire on lies and manipulation. Hannah, meanwhile, began to rebuild. It wasn't easy, and the pain of her marriage falling apart lingered. But she was strong, stronger than I'd ever given her credit for. And through it all, she came to realize that sometimes, the hardest thing isn't leaving someone, it's realizing that they never deserved to be part of your life in the first place. Greg had been caught in his own web of lies, and now, there was nothing left to hold him up. His reckoning had come, and it was a long time coming. It had been a few weeks since Greg's world fell apart. The local news was still buzzing with stories about his financial ruin, the failed real estate deals, and the criminal investigations into his shady dealings. He wasn't the man anyone had thought he was just a man who had been so desperate to climb the ladder that he had burned every bridge on the way up. Now, there was nothing left but the wreckage of his ambition. Hannah and I had found a new rhythm in the aftermath. She was still processing everything that had happened, but I could see the weight starting to lift off her shoulders. She had her moments of doubt, her moments of wondering if she'd been too quick to walk away. But as the days passed, I saw her becoming stronger, more confident in her decisions. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. For both of us. One afternoon, after a quiet lunch in the backyard, Hannah turned to me, her eyes a little clearer than before. "Dad, I don't know if I ever really thanked you for showing me the truth. I don't think I could have done this without you." I smiled softly, placing my hand on hers. "You didn't need to thank me, sweetheart. You've always been stronger than you think. I just gave you the nudge you needed." Hannah nodded, her eyes focused on something beyond the yard. "It's hard, you know. Seeing Greg for what he really is. I spent years believing in someone who wasn't even close to the person I thought he was." "You weren't the one who failed, Hannah. Greg was," I said gently. "You didn't fail him. He failed himself." She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. "I know. I just have to keep reminding myself of that. I have to move on." That was all we said for a while, but it was enough. The healing was slow but steady, and I could see it in Hannah's eyes, a spark of hope I hadn't seen in months. She was beginning to find peace again. As for Greg, I hadn't heard from him in days. The last time I saw him, he was a broken man, standing in front of me in the cold light of reality. He had tried to beg for my sympathy, but I had none left for him. What he had done was unforgivable. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But even as I stood in the wreckage of his life, I couldn't help but feel a faint trace of pity. It was impossible not to, even for someone as unrepentant as him. One afternoon, I received a letter from Greg's lawyer. At first, I thought it was just more legal threats, but when I opened it, I found something I hadn't expected, a handwritten note from Greg himself. It was short, direct, and painful to read. "Walter. I've lost everything. I know I'm not asking for your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I never wanted it to go this far. I was wrong. I was too proud, too selfish, and now it's cost me everything. I'll never get back what I've lost, but I hope you understand that I'm sorry for the hurt I caused. I'll take responsibility for my actions. I know I can't fix the damage, but I'll try to make things right, starting with making sure Hannah gets what she deserves from this mess. Greg." I folded the letter slowly and set it aside. I didn't know what to make of it. Greg was finally admitting his guilt, but it felt hollow, like a man who had come too late to the realization that he had destroyed everything he loved. I didn't feel angry anymore. There was no satisfaction in this kind of victory, just a quiet, almost sorrowful acceptance of the consequences. The next day, I met with Greg's lawyer. He handed over the settlement paperwork, a final attempt to clear the mess Greg had created. The agreement was simple: Greg would relinquish control of all his properties to the lender, and his remaining assets would be used to pay off some of the debts. More importantly, the settlement stipulated that Greg would have to pay for Hannah's therapy and any financial support she needed for the next few years. As I signed the papers, I couldn't help but think that this was the least Greg could do, even if it didn't come close to repairing the damage. He had no more power in the situation, no more manipulation or lies. His money and influence had run out. And now, it was over. But even as I left the lawyer's office, I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg's downfall was a little too late. He had been so consumed by his ambition that he had missed the one thing that really mattered: family. The one thing that could have saved him. And now, with everything lost, all he had left was the hollow shell of the man he had tried so desperately to be. Months passed, and life began to settle back into a new normal. Greg's name was slowly fading from the news, and I could tell that Hannah was finding her feet again. She had started working at a new job, one that she was excited about, and she even began to reconnect with old friends. It was a slow process, but it was progress. One evening, we sat on the porch together, watching the sun set over the yard. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt this peaceful. The storm that had clouded our lives for so long was finally over. "Dad," Hannah said, her voice thoughtful. Do you think Greg will ever change? I didn't have an immediate answer. The truth was, I didn't know. Some people don't change, no matter how much they hurt. They get consumed by their own pride and never look back. But I could see the pain in her eyes, and I knew she wasn't asking about Greg anymore. She was asking about herself, about how to move forward. I reached over and squeezed her hand. People can change, but they have to want to. You can't carry someone else's burden, sweetheart. You've got to put it down and walk away. She smiled softly, her eyes brighter than I'd seen them in months. I think I'm starting to understand that. And with that, we sat in silence, watching the fading light. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but we had learned something important in the last few months. The truth might be painful, but it also brought freedom. It brought the kind of peace that couldn't be bought, only earned. And as for Greg, well, he would have to live with the consequences of his choices, just as we all do. Author's note. This story shows that even in the face of betrayal and deceit, there is always room for justice. The consequences of Greg's actions were inevitable, but it wasn't the wrath of others that led to his downfall, it was his own decisions. This is a reminder that in life, we all have to take responsibility for our actions, and the truth, no matter how painful, will always come to light. Through it all, Hannah and Walter found healing not in revenge, but in truth, and in each other.